Thank you for joining Jennifer Schaus and Associates in our 2019 Webinar Wednesday series. We are coming to you live from downtown Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday, and you can find the upcoming schedule on our website. Past webinars and all recordings are also on our website and on our YouTube channel, along with over 160 other recordings on federal contracting topics. All are complimentary. If you have questions for our speaker today, you can email her directly with the contact information you'll see on our last slide. And this is just a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C. based firm and provide services for federal contractors. This ranges from market analysis reports to proposal writing and also post-award compliance. More information is on our website, so please visit us. And these are a few upcoming events that you can find more information here or also on our website. And we now offer advertising. You can email me for more information. And our webinar today is sponsored by AccuTrack, and here's a short message from them.
AccuTrack Consulting and Accounting Services is an 8A WOSB CPA firm committed to supporting entities to sustain growth in government contracting. Our outstanding DCAA accounting solutions reduce audit risk, improve cash flows, and give you peace of mind. Contact us today to learn how we can enhance your DCAA accounting efforts.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Our speaker today is Gina Mushriki. Thank you for joining us today, Gina. And we are going to be covering small business affiliation and rules. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Mallory. Hello, everybody. Just a little bit about myself before we get started. I'm the founding principal of Corporate Law Solutions. We are a firm based in Washington, D.C. with offices in Philadelphia. And we advise small businesses and government agencies on government contracting matters, which is why today's topic is near and dear to my heart, because it talks about small businesses in the government contracting world, and it's meant to be a primer for all of you that are either newly in this field or are interested in entering into this field. But if you have expertise, this is an area of the law that has been changing and will continue to change, so can still be worth your while. So let's go ahead and get started. Mallory, if you can go to the next slide, please. And while that happens, I'll just go through a brief overview of what we're going to cover today. As the title kind of explains, we're going to be talking about small business within the context of government contracting and specifically affiliation rules, what it means to be small in government contracting, why and when size matters, and the situations where a business might meet the small size standards, but sort of fall outside of them or run afoul of them due to certain business affiliations. Next slide, please. So we'll start with those three things. The first one is what it means to be small. And the government basically looks at businesses in terms of size determination based on two major factors. The number of personnel that a business has and the total business receipts or revenues. And it takes these two factors and looks at the business within each NAICS code and makes a size determination for that NAICS code as to whether the business is small or not. Unfortunately, for some businesses that are kind of in limbo land, they're not large, but they're not small, they're considered large. And I'll go back and explain for those of us that are not familiar with NAICS codes. A NAICS code NAICS stands for North American Industry Classification System, and it's basically a code that is assigned by industry or a particular product or service, and it's provided to almost all federal and local government solicitations or procurements. And the SBA sets forth a particular size standard for each NAICS code. So if a company meets that size standard based on number of personnel and total business receipts or revenues, then they are determined to be small. So for example, NAICS code 517110 is for wired telecommunication carriers, and that has a size standard of 1,500 employees. So if you are a company that is in the wired telecommunication carriers industry, and you have 1,000 employees, you are considered to be a small business with respect to your personnel. The other prong of that, like we said, is the business receipts or revenues. For example, NAICS code 541511 is for computer programming services, and that has a size standard of $25.5 million per annum. So if you are a company that provides computer programming services and your annual revenue, including passive income, is $20 million, then you will be considered small with respect to your revenues. And the way that that's calculated, or it has been calculated, has been changing or will be changing, and we'll get more into that later. One other thing before we move on, which is kind of the focal point of this webinar, is your personnel and your revenues include any affiliates. So it's important to be careful of that in terms of determining size and determining both revenues and personnel amounts, and how affiliation with other businesses, whether they're small or large, is put into practice. And we'll talk more about that later. Next slide, please. So, how does the government determine these two factors that are largely based on numbers? One, the SBA and federal agencies, as well as local agencies, depend on self-certification. And what that means is each business basically certifies that it meets these small business size standards for the particular NAICS code that it identifies with. So when does a company do that? The companies do that at two main points. One is when companies register on SAM.gov or register with the SBA. They register as a small business. If they meet those standards, and part of the registration is that the company certifies whether or not it is a small business. Companies and their representatives need to be careful, because each time you sign reps and certs that you are making when renewing this registration, or when initially making this registration, you're making a formal certification that your size representations are accurate. And there's penalties for false certifications, so just beware of that. The other point when companies self-certify is when a company is making an offer on a bid or in a proposal process in response to solicitation. That's the general rule. It's also important to be careful and be mindful of when companies are awarded what we call blanket purchase agreements or IDIQs, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts, because those type of contracts are intended to be sort of an open-ended agreement between the company and the government saying, hey, we will order from you based on a task order, and then each time a task order is issued, the company is considered to be making a new offer, and so is considered to be recertifying as to its small business standard, and that it meets that size. In terms of the period of measurement, specifically with respect to revenues and personnel numbers, this has been sort of a much discussed topic because until very recently, the government was measuring these numbers based on the 3 years preceding the certification. And so it would be an average of the 3 years of revenues or 3 years of personnel. But this is in the process of changing, and it will go back 5 years instead of 3 years. So that's just something to stay on the lookout for. Changes of these nature kind of take a while from when they're announced to when they're actually put into effect. So just make sure you're following the correct rule and you're not falling outside of self-certification as to business size standards unintentionally. Next slide, please. So we've talked about how size is determined and when it's determined. The next major thing we need to talk about is why it all matters. And as some of you probably know, small business is kind of a big topic in government because there's a general policy that small business involvement is good for the economy. And so the government, both federal and local governments, make it a point by way of general policy as well as statute and regulation to ensure that small businesses receive contracting dollars. So how does the government do that? The government does that by setting aside procurement, which essentially means that only small businesses or only small businesses of certain sizes or certain status can compete or qualify to bid or submit a proposal on particular procurements. So the eligibility to compete depends on the size standards set by the SBA or by the SBA and the contracting agency for that particular procurement. Next slide, please. So, given that fact, this is kind of where the rubber hits the road. Given the fact that the government sets aside and sort of eliminates or sort of decreases the level of competition on small business set-aside procurements, the government is very weary of businesses, both large and small, taking advantage of this special status. And so they've put in rules to kind of prevent large businesses from taking over and performing contracts that are set aside for small businesses. One of these rules is called the Rule of Affiliation. And basically what it means is that the government will look at a relationship between a small business and any of its affiliates to determine whether this small business meets the size standards that are set aside for the particular procurement. That particular rule is set forth in 13 Code of Federal Regulations, Section 121.103, for those of you that want to go and look at the specific language that the government provides. But it basically looks at a big picture kind of approach. The government looks at the totality of circumstances and has stated that no single factor will affect its determination as to whether one or more companies are affiliated under the rules of affiliation. So, what are some of the relevant factors? The SBA will consider factors like ownership of the companies, management, previous relationships with the two or more companies, ties to one another, contractual relationships, and then the SBA will take these totality of circumstances and determine whether an affiliation exists. So even though the SBA and the government has found that no single factor is sufficient to constitute affiliation, they may also, find bits and pieces of each of these factors and other factors, and will make a determination that two companies are affiliated. So next slide, please. We'll look at some of the examples of affiliation. We've touched upon these briefly, but I think it's more helpful to look at it from a kind of detailed perspective, and sort of try and think of it with respect to your company if you're a small business, or if you're a large business that's kind of teaming or subcontracting or forming a joint venture with a small business, and see if kind of these examples trigger something that might set you afoul of the affiliation rules. Like we discussed before, stock ownership or even options for stock are one of these rules. So, for example, if there's a person that owns or has the power to control 50% or more of one company's stock, or even a block of voting stock that's large compared to the small business, then the SBA is going to determine that it has the power to control it due to the stock ownership. So it's also important to remember that control doesn't necessarily mean affirmative control. It can also mean negative control. So think of it in examples where there's a minority shareholder that may have the ability under a company's charter or bylaws to prevent a quorum, for example, or otherwise block an action by the shareholders or by the board of directors. And I know this is getting into the nitty-gritty a little bit, but since these examples don't really, may not really come to mind readily when you're thinking about stock ownership and what it means to come afoul of the rules of affiliation, I'm taking some time to go through them. Another example is merger agreements. So it's important to note that the SBA treats stock options and convertible securities, as well as merger agreements, as if the rights granted by these instruments have already been exercised. Essentially, if you have the right pursuant to a contractual arrangement or a securities instrument, the SBA is going to consider as if the company has those or an individual has those rights already. Merger agreements is an example of that. On the flip side of that, if you've entered into a letter of interest, for example, or a memorandum of understanding to enter into merger talks, but you don't have a merger agreement, then the SBA has determined that that's not sufficient to create affiliation. Common management is another sticking point. Where the companies have one or more officers, common officers, directors, partners, or members of the board, and they just share those individuals, so to speak. So just be careful of that. I'll speak of identity of interest, and then we'll move on to the next slide afterwards. Identity of interest is basically when there's family relationships. So two companies that are owned by immediate family members will be presumed to have an affiliation with one another. Another example would be individuals or companies that have common investments or that are dependent on one another through contractual relationships. The next three examples are kind of self-explanatory. So I'll move on so we can focus on one last topic that's important in terms of affiliation rules, and that is the ostensible subcontractor rule. Next slide, please, Mallory. The word ostensible is appearing to be true, but not necessarily so. And so that's basically, kind of a spoiler alert for what the ostensible subcontractor rule is all about. It's a situation where on paper, two companies, or in particular a subcontractor, may appear to be independent or performing as a subcontractor, but it's really not the case. And this particular rule is also part of the general affiliation rules located at 13 CFR 121.103. And basically, this is a situation where you have a small business prime contractor with a large business subcontractor that on paper is supposed to be, assisting, but in reality, the large subcontractor is performing the primary and vital requirements of the contract, or the SBA finds that the small business prime is relying excessively on this large business subcontractor. Next slide, please. So kind of to wrap up, there's a lot to talk about in terms of affiliation and how it can be used as sort of a sword and a shield at the same time. If you think a particular company is or a particular competitor is going over its size limitations that are set forth by the size standard, it can be a basis for protest, basically. But that's kind of outside of the discussion for today. But in terms of protecting a company or protecting your company when you're trying to avoid affiliation, try and look at the factors that we've discussed today in terms of, if you're bidding on a contract, who's managing that contract? As a small business, make sure that you have sufficient involvement and that you're not unduly relying on the large business. Who has the background and the expertise to perform the contract? Obviously, in joint ventures or teaming agreements or in subcontracting arrangements, small businesses rely on large businesses to bring in their expertise, but it's important to also show that the small business has sufficient background and expertise to perform at least the portion that it is performing of the contract. Contract capture, who sort of ran after this particular solicitation, who ran after getting the award, who developed the proposal or the bid, how are the tasks divided, what amount of work is being performed under the contract, and are we running afoul of the subcontracting limitations? How much of the staff that's performing the contract is actually, part of the small business versus the large business subcontractor. So I know that's a lot to go through in a short time. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Thank you so much for joining us today. And Mallory, I'll hand it over to you from here.
Thank you, Gina, for sharing your knowledge and insight today. Today's presentation has been recorded and can be found on our website or YouTube channel within about 48 hours. If you have questions about today's topic, please contact her at the phone number or email shown on your screen. Thank you, everybody. This concludes the webinar.